Montreal Press Club remains a beacon of journalistic integrity in today's constantly shifting media landscape, where freedom of speech, the sovereign right, is being challenged right here in our own backyard. On that note, I would like now to share a first-person account of one boy's curiosity to try and understand why.
Papa, crois-moi, je n'ai jamais cru que je vivrais sans toi. Je n'ai jamais cru que tu ne me réveillerais pas chaque matin pour aller à l'école, comme d'habitude. Je n'avais jamais imaginé ça. Tu es en prison loin de moi parce que tu t'es battu pour tes idées. Tu es une personne pacifique qui aime les gens et leur souhaite de bonnes choses. Pourquoi es-tu en prison, papa? C'est la question que je me pose chaque jour. Est-ce que c'est vrai que c'était parce que tu as créé un site web qui encourageait le débat politique et social? Quand maman m'a dit que tu étais en prison à cause de tes idées, j'ai cherché ton nom sur Google. J'étais surpris de voir tout le soutien que tu recevais de tout le monde. Si ce n'était pas de maman, nous aurions plus souffert de ton absence. Oui, maman est forte, alors ne t'inquiète pas, ça fait 2 ans et demi qu'elle ait fait tout ce qu'il peut pour compenser ton absence, mais rien ne peut te remplacer. Mes sœurs et moi, on se demandait en secret comment on pourrait te faire sortir de prison. Myriam a dit qu'il irait en Arabie Saoudite, qu'elle briserait la prison et frapperait les gardiens pour que papa sorte de là. Il faut que papa revienne à la maison. Nous attendons le jour où ton avion arrivera à l'aéroport de Montréal. Tu me verras qui t'attend et qui pleure et je n'arrêterai pas avant que tu me prennes dans tes bras et que tu sèches mes larmes. Doudi, ton petit trésor.
Ensaf, Haïdar, Doudi et Myriam, je vous prie de vous mettre debout pour que l'auditoire vous salue. Many of us hold strong principles, But how many of us would choose torture and imprisonment rather than accept injustice as our portion? Vanishingly few, which makes those heroes who do make that choice, objects of awe and fascination. Raif, one of 11 children, was 9 years old when his mother died. His father, Mohammed Badawi, was of a tyrannical disposition. In 2008, a few years after Raif had started his blog calling for social reform in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed began an online smear campaign against his son, attacking Raif's internet forum on YouTube and accusing him of apostasy. This incitement was instrumental in stirring up anger amongst the clerisy. Mohammed was pleased when 151 imams issued a fatwa declaring Raif a murtad, an apostate, and demanding the death sentence. I want to speak now about Ensaf, whose name in Arabic can mean both justice and patience, an apt summary of her partnership with Raif. Ensaf married Raif against her wealthy family's wishes. In doing so, she gave up a life of luxury and the social security of a close kinship circle. But Ensaf, once committed, never looked back, in spite of frequent geographical dislocation, social isolation, and financial insecurity, with periods of actual penury, not to mention realistic fears of arrest at any time. Raif had begun his internet forum on his own, but after a time, Ensaf joined in its production, and she even began writing for it, thereby implicating herself materially in whatever consequences might ensue. This activity effectively turned Raif and Ensaf into orphans. For, as Raif's notoriety spread, Ensaf's family felt socially shamed by having liberals as kinsmen. A sister told Ensaf they had, quote, caused a scandal. Nobody, not even her mother or sisters to whom she had been very close growing up, stood by her as, with the legal net tightening around them, life became intolerably tense for the couple. Ensaf's family urged her to divorce Raif. She refused. Tightening the screws, they threatened to cut her off from her inheritance. She didn't blink. She was, in fact, disinherited, and all lines of communication were cut with her. Years later, in Sherbrooke, Ensaf would only learn of her father's death on Facebook. And she believes, as per the family's threats, that her marriage has been formally annulled in Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, Raif's father was petitioning for the couple's 3 children, Najwa, Doudi, and Miriam, to be removed from Ensaf and given to him, a chilling idea, but possible once Raif's imprisonment left Ensaf without male guardianship. For these reasons, it was imperative that Ensaf and the children leave the country. Because the charge of apostasy could not be sustained, since Raif had never slandered Islam in his writings, Raif's death sentence was eventually commuted to 7 years in prison and 600 lashes. Shackled and exposed to a gathered crowd, Raif endured the first 50 lashes in 2015. Only the force of global condemnation has prevented Saudi Arabia from executing the rest of the prescribed penalty, which would almost certainly have resulted in his death. Ensaf, who has been living in Sherbrooke, Quebec, since 2013, forced herself to watch this barbaric scene on video. At that point, her children still did not know why their father had not joined them. Raif, wishing to spare them unnecessary suffering, had been adamant that they be kept in innocent ignorance of the terrible things that were happening to him. Ensaf was running out of excuses. Finally, though, it became clear that if Ensaf did not tell them, somebody else would, an intolerable thought. The children took the news in sadness but relief. They had known, as children do, that something was very wrong with the excuses they had heard for their father's prolonged absence. Since then, the children have been enthusiastic comrades in the long march to free Raif. One of the consolations Ensaf has treasured throughout his ordeal is the blessing of modern communications. Ensaf and Raif's romance began with a wrong number on her cell phone. Their entire courtship played out over cell phones, offering Ensaf the only privacy she had from the curious eyes of her family. Without the cell phone, there is no possible way they could have met in person or kept their optimism alive in the worst of times. Modern methods of communication have, in fact, been a force for both good and bad in this exotic saga, shifting in affect between extreme contemporaneity and something like a Grimm's fairy tale. Cell phones, YouTube, electronic blogs, Facebook and Twitter campaigns. Raif's blogging landed him in trouble, but global communications networks are keeping his jailer's feet to the fire and have saved him from the torture and death he would have suffered if obscurity had been his portion. Upon arrival here, Ensaf and her children spoke neither English nor French, nor had they known the rigors of a northern winter. But they were given a warm welcome by representatives from Amnesty International and local social service systems. The city of Sherbrooke has embraced them and their cause. The family has made lifelong friends there. Every Friday at noon, a vigil for Raif is held outside City Hall in Sherbrooke, and Ensaf is never alone. The mayor of Sherbrooke would have liked to be here tonight, but was prevented by a previous engagement. Everything is in readiness for Raif's welcome to his new home. It seems to us that with a new Saudi king bent on cautious modernization of his kingdom and motivated to gain respect and support in the West, now would be a good moment for our government to renew its efforts to see Raif freed and brought home to Canada. May it come to pass in our time, inshallah. In Montreal, when one thinks of freedom and human rights, two names spring immediately to mind: Irwin Cotler and Beryl Weissman. Internationally renowned human rights champion Irwin Cotler, Natan Sharansky's lawyer and founder of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, would have been here tonight if he didn't have to be in Israel. But he has sent us a statement which will be delivered by Beryl Weissman, who, amongst his many other adventures, once served as Irwin Cotler's first executive assistant when Irwin was Canada's Minister of Justice. Beryl Weissman is editor-in-chief of the Suburban newspaper group, publisher of the Métropolitain, Montreal's bilingual journal of political, social, and economic opinion, and founder and president of the Institute for Public Affairs of Montreal, a national advocacy organization.
What did Raif Badawi, what was his crime? His crime was he wanted to speak. He wanted a debate. His blogs didn't attack the Saudi government. It opened up questions. It opened up questions of the place of religion in a society. It opened up questions of the place of a free exchange of ideas, even in a theocratic society. He asked questions. And that is why we honor him today. And I ask you to keep in mind, as you listen to the words of Irwin Cotler, and as you listen to the words of Jordan Peterson later, that as Sinclair Lewis wrote so many years ago, it can happen anywhere. Irwin writes the following: Raif Badawi is an authentic human rights hero, now in his 6th year of imprisonment for standing up for the very rights and freedoms of which Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman now envisages for Saudi Arabia. Badawi's unjust imprisonment and torture and detention are not only a standing violation of international human rights and humanitarian law, and of Saudi Arabia's own obligations, both under its own constitution and in its treaty relations with Canada, but that imprisonment constitutes a criminalization of freedom, une criminalisation de liberté, a criminalization of freedom of conscience, and a criminalization of freedom of religion, and a criminalization of freedom of expression. In a word, la criminalisation d'innocence. I want to commend the Montreal Press Club for giving its inaugural Freedom Award to Raif Badawi, a most deserving and exemplary recipient, and for presenting it to his wife, Ensaf Haidar, who has been such a courageous advocate on his behalf in Canada and internationally. Let us hope that this will be a prelude to Badawi's release and reunification with his family here in Quebec. Juste un mot d'information et d'encouragement. La Fondation Raif Badawi pour la liberté mérite votre appui. Ensaf Haidar est le président. Il y a un comité de direction non pareil des plus grandes personnes qui sont impliquées dans la question de liberté partout au monde. Le siège social est à Montréal. Je vous invite de regarder le site web et de faire votre contribution et d'être en contact avec Madame Haidar. Et je vous remercie pour votre attention and for your attendance here today.
The New York Times' David Brooks, a columnist widely respected on both the political right and left, acknowledges Peterson as, quote, the most influential public intellectual in the Western world right now. Brooks is not given to hyperbole. On YouTube, Dr. Peterson's biblical series 1, Introduction to the Idea of God and Identity Politics and the Marxist Lie of White Privilege, have accumulated more than 50 million views. This does not represent idle web surfing. It is purposeful viewing. It's a culturally significant phenomenon that any objective observer knows to take seriously. Dr. Peterson became a household name in September 2016 when he became embroiled in debate around Bill C-16, commonly referred to as the Transgender Bill, which sought to enshrine the rights of transgender people at the federal level, complementing already existing provincial initiatives, by adding gender identity and expression to human rights and hate speech laws. It passed in November 2016. The issue for Dr. Peterson was not so much his willingness to accommodate transgender people as the idea that the state should have the power to coerce citizens to use made-up words that in this case indicate a concept of gender fluidity for which there is no scientific evidence in order to satisfy someone's subjective feelings. His refusal to soft pedal this and any number of other opinions regarding postmodern theories that he regards as bogus and socially harmful soon made him the bane of progressives, but conversely, the champion of people who identify with Dr. Peterson himself as terrified traditionalists. Along with many of his fans, I share his horror of totalitarianism in any guise, whether it manifests itself in oppressive regimes or in the velvet totalitarianism of the authoritarian left on university campuses. Dr. Peterson's detractors, frustrated by his success, often rather hilariously refer to him as the previously obscure Jordan Peterson. As though that could not be said of Einstein or Moses or, anybody, right? Ironically, long before he became a household name, Jordan Peterson had for many years been a star and not at all obscure in his own domain. Dr. Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and a clinical psychologist specializing in the assessment and improvement of personality and performance, a practice he suspended in 2017 in order to attend to the many new projects and opportunities that have unfolded for him over the last few years, to put it mildly. His main areas of study are in abnormal social and personality psychology, with a particular interest in the psychology of religious and ideological beliefs. He has authored or co-authored over 100 widely cited academic papers. In the course of his career, Dr. Peterson studied and conducted research at Harvard University while plotting and writing his first book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, published in 1999, which in 2004 was made into a 13-part TV series. Many of the ideas from that book reappear in a more reader-friendly version in his new book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, which in mid-April passed the $1 million in sales mark. It has since publication in January, but still, it doesn't appear on the New York Times bestseller list. That should be noted. It has since publication in January, almost from its first day, been first or second on virtually all bestseller lists in the Anglosphere. 12 Rules for Life is what it sounds like, a self-help book which, even as I speak the words, exudes a strong lowbrow aroma. In truth, it is all-brow. It can be read at many different levels. Dr. Peterson is reaching out to the world and will grasp any hand that reaches back. Like all self-help books, it is designed to bolster a faltering sense of purpose, or in many cases, especially for young people, to supply the very idea of the purpose-driven life, a concept many of them are not offered in the normal course of their lives today. Since the Bill C-16 controversy, freedom of speech and the name of Dr. Jordan Peterson have been continually intertwined in the public forum. Our committee could not have imagined anyone better placed to comment on the principles and the sacrifices made in their name that are associated with the name of our honoree, Raif Badawi, and we are so grateful that he accepted our invitation. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Barbara, and to everyone for first inviting me and second for attending. So I'm going to try to do something very difficult this evening. I'm going to try to put the idea of the right to free speech in the broadest possible historical context. I want to start with a comment, though. You know, we have an idea built into our human rights legislation that all the rights are equal in some sense, and that can't be true, because rights conflict with one another, and when things conflict they have to be hierarchically organized, and what that means is that there's an implication that there is a hierarchy of rights as well as a hierarchy of responsibilities, and that it's also incumbent on us to determine the nature of that hierarchy and to determine what constitutes the sovereign, let's say the sovereign right. And I would say you might think of that as a modern conundrum that would only be of interest to countries that have formalized bills of rights, for example, but it's not a new problem. It's an extraordinarily old problem, because there's no difference between determining the hierarchy of your rights and determining how to live together successfully. It is exactly the same problem. One's only articulated in a legal form, and the problem of how we should live together in the most productive possible manner, everything considered, is as old as mankind itself. In fact, I would say far older than that, because the same problem bedevils social animals way down the phylogenetic chain. And so this is an unbelievably archaic problem. Now, years ago, when I started thinking, I suppose, in earnest, I was trying to address what I later recognized as a postmodern problem. And the problem was, this was in the late 70s and early 80s, when the Cold War was madly raging, because it peaked in 1962 and it peaked again in about 1984, thereabouts. And of course, at that time, people were very terrified about the potential outcome of the Cold War, and for very good reason. And I was very curious about this, like insanely curious about it. It was obsessing me. I couldn't understand two things. I couldn't understand why the world had divided itself into two opposing narratives, why that had happened at all, and also why these narratives were of such importance to people, apparently, that we were willing to arm ourselves far beyond the teeth and risk massive mutual annihilation to battle out the conflict between these two ways of looking at the world. And I was curious. I mean, the first the first question was, were these merely two ways of looking at the world? Now, because you might think, well, there's no shortage of ways to live in the world. That's a morally relativistic stance. And there's something to that, obviously, because people differ, and people differ in occupations, and they differ in outlook, and so forth. They differ in political beliefs. So there's obviously many ways that we can thrive in the world. And so some degree of flexibility with regards to what constitutes your fundamental axioms obviously is necessary. But there's a deeper question, and this is a very deep question. I actually think it's the question at the bottom of the postmodern conundrum, which is whether or not there are any reliable meta-narratives, let's say, overarching narratives that can unite people in some fundamental way. And so I was curious, were these just two arbitrary ways of looking at the world, both potentially equally valid? And were we battling that out because we didn't know and there was no other way to battle it out? Or was there something deeper at stake? Was it possible that one or the other system was correct in some deep manner? And I do truly believe that I entered that universe of questions, let's say, with as open as a mind as possible, because I actually wanted to find out the answer, you know, because, well, it seemed to me the fundamental question that obviously we fought a whole Cold War about it. It was the fundamental question. It was the question everyone's minds should have been concentrated on. And so I started to study deeply this particular question. The first question was, well, what were beliefs made out of? Like, what exactly is it? What are we talking about when we talk about a belief? What does it mean that you have beliefs? Well, how are beliefs structured? You know, so that was a psychological question rather than a political or economic question. And that took me a long time to figure out, because I didn't know if the fundamental question was going to be sociological or political or economic or psychological. And it turned out to be psychological, or perhaps it turned out to be spiritual. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you could grasp belief, what would constitute a credible belief? And what would it mean for a belief to be credible? And I can give you a hint about that. I learned this from Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, brilliant theorist, a genuine genius. He was interested in how children organized games. And he thought of games, the organization of games by children, as the precursor to adult interaction. And he made some very interesting observations about games, you know, especially pretend games, which are quite sophisticated, because children will get together and play pretend games, and what they'll do is they act out a simulation of the world. Maybe they play house. They all get together and they cast each other in different roles. And then they each act out those roles, and they do that in order to simulate something important that they're going to have to adapt to. But Piaget noted a couple of things. The first thing he noted was that children playing games can play the games in a group. Thank you very much. Can play a game in a group, but if you take them out of the group and you ask them what the rules of the game are, they don't know. They can't articulate the rules of the game. Yet, when you put them together in the group, they can play the game. And I thought, oh, that's just like adults, you see, because we wouldn't need a psychology otherwise, right? Because we'd all be transparent to ourselves already. So what that means is when we all get together and play a game like the one that we're playing in this room, for example, we all can play the game when we're together, but if we brought us out and said, well, what are the rules, we wouldn't be able to articulate them. And then I thought, well, that means that those rules evolved in a real sense, like they evolved in a behavioral competition. Then I thought, well, that's a lot like what's happening with animals. So if you look at how a chimpanzee troop is organized, or a wolf pack, any social animal for that matter, going way down the phylogenetic chain, they have to interact with one another in a manner that sustains the group, because otherwise they all die, obviously, and that sustains the individuals within the group and offers the individuals some scope of action. And so there's a set of implicit constraints on the manner in which creatures interact, or they don't live. And Piaget also came to the same conclusion with regards to children's games. And this is where he made a distinction that's so crucial, because Piaget was actually interested in bridging the gap between science and religion. That was his fundamental motivation, although very few people know that. And he was interested in bridging the gap between science and ethics. And he was interested in how ethics evolved as a concept, and then as a practically applicable, as something that was practically applicable. And he made some very interesting comments about games. And he said, well, look, what constitutes a good game? Well, one rule is everybody plays voluntarily. that's a really good game. And then he made another claim, which was quite cool, which was, imagine that you had a game A and game B, and they were competing against a target. And in game B, people were being forced to play, and in game A, people were playing voluntarily. And then you track their track record with regards to competitive advantage over time. The game that people were playing voluntarily would win because the people who were playing wouldn't have to waste any effort in enforcement cost. I thought, oh God, that's so smart. It's so smart because you can see the idea of the emergence of an ethic there, eh? And not an ethic that's rationally constructed. It's an ethic that's actually emerging from the bottom up. Now, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche also pointed out that our ethic actually emerged from the bottom up. It wasn't rational. It wasn't top down. It wasn't Enlightenment oriented, even though the Enlightenment might have codified it as part of a process of a codification that took place over a very long period of time. And then I read other things, say about the way that animals organize their troops. This was later, but it's relevant to our talk today. The primatologist Frans de Waal, for example, has tried to find out what makes chimpanzee troops stable across time. And you know, you kind of have this idea that a chimpanzee troop is driven, let's say, by the most dominant, powerful male, the most aggressive, cruel, tyrannical chimpanzee dominates. And that isn't what Frans de Waal found. What he found was that in order that those sorts of chimpanzee troops have leaders that meet very violent ends. Because no matter how tyrannical you are as top chimp, 2 chimps 3/4 your size can take you out. And they will. And chimpanzees are unbelievably brutal and very, very strong. And so tyrannical chimpanzee troops are unstable. It's like, that's a major league discovery, man, because it starts to open up the possibility that the ethic upon which functional states are predicated is far deeper than any mere story or any mere rationality. And that's a really exciting possibility, because what it means is that there might be something at the bottom of our ethic that's really there. It's not just some arbitrary constructed narrative. It's not just one set of ways to live in the world among many. And I would say, and I tried to outline this partly in 12 Rules for Life and more in detail in Maps of Meaning, that the evidence on that is already in, is that there is a convergent ethic that emerges from the bottom up over evolutionary spans of time, over millions of years, over hundreds of thousands of years, over tens of thousands of years, as people learn how to act in a manner that sustains them as individuals now and a week from now and a month from now and a year from now. So it has to be iteratable, that sustains them and their families simultaneously, that sustains them and their families and their communities across all those time frames simultaneously. And that's a very, very tight set of constraints. And so there might be a very large number of ways to interpret the world, as the postmodernists accurately have it, but there are not a very large number of ways to exist successfully in the world. In fact, it's extraordinarily constrained. It's constrained by the necessity of playing an iterative voluntary game. And that's a tight constraint, as any of you who are married know, right? Well, I mean this absolutely definitively, because you see, the marriage is a very interesting balancing act, because it has to be good for you and it has to be good for your wife, let's say, but it also has to be good for the two of you. And it has to, and maybe that's superordinate to each of you as individuals, and it has to be good for you in a way that's good for your children, and that has to work in society, and it has to be something that you can play out moment by moment and hour to hour and day to day and month to month and week to week. And you know perfectly well that there isn't much deviation from the straight and narrow path if you're going to play that game, because there's just too many ways of falling into trouble, and there's way more ways of falling into trouble than not falling into trouble. Okay, so that's the first thing. So imagine this. So this is the idea. So the ethic emerges from the bottom up as we learn how to organize ourselves in ever more complex societies, sustainable societies. And we don't know what we're doing. Okay, but then what happens is, because we're insanely curious and capable of self-recognition, we start to tell stories about how it is that we're acting. And the stories have two forms. One story is about the structures that we exist in, and that's the stories about other people. And every story is about other people, right? Because we live in a social world, and you never see a story, you never go to a movie, you never read a novel that isn't about society. And no wonder, because that's our environment, society. So stories are about society, and they're about how societies succeed and fail, and they're about how individuals within that society succeed or fail. Because what we're trying to do is to watch ourselves, and I mean again over the massive historical time frame, we're trying to watch how it is that we act when we act properly and figure out how to do it as individuals. And the first way we do that is to code it in stories. That's what stories are for. That's what great literature is for. That's why there are great villains and great heroes in great literature. Because you want to know how to be a great hero unless you want to be a great villain. And if you want to be a great hero, you can learn from great villains the opposite of how to act. And so you get incredibly sophisticated representations emerging out of that process, so that take on an archetypal form. So for example, the motif of the hostile brothers, which is developed in Christianity into the twin adversaries of Christ and Satan, or Cain and Abel, are the idea of the hero who thrives in the social world and brings renewal to the cosmos, so to speak, against the deadly adversary. And that's exactly what you need to know. And again, it's not arbitrary. It's not an arbitrary set of propositions. It's predicated on the observation of successful and unsuccessful patterns of behavior over very, 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 very long stretches of time. So there's a behavioral platform, and then there's a narrative representation of that platform, and then the two things start to interact, because once you have drama and literature, you can learn from drama and literature and alter how you behave, and your ethic becomes portable. And then what happens after that is that thinkers who now have both the behavioral strata and the representational strata in front of them, right? The procedural ethic, the behavioral ethic, plus the storied representation, step one step back from that, especially after it's written down. This is why works like the Bible are of such critical importance, because the dramatic patterns are then written down, and then you can step back from them with your consciousness, and you can start to analyze them for the rule-based content. You see that emerging to some degree in the story of Moses. That's actually what's laid out in part in the story of Moses, because Moses is leading his people through the desert and watching how they fight and watching how they behave, and then he has this, so it's all very, very dramatic. Then he has this tremendous revelation, which is, this is how we already act, right? And so what happens is the rules are codified on the basis of the observation of the patterns that are already extant, that are functional. And it's a transformation of consciousness. At that point, you have your ethic, which is far deeper than anything that you can imagine, start to be articulated out into the body of laws. And that's the point at which you have, let's say, true philosophy and the beginning of the body of laws. It's called the body of laws for a reason. And so, well, I thought that was all just amazing to have observed that, to think about that bottom-up process. And then I started reading a lot of religious mythology, and I ran across this motif that was developed in great detail by a Romanian, Mircea Eliade, who was a great scholar of religions, who wrote remarkable books, including A History of Religious Ideas, which is a highly recommended book. And he talked about this interesting motif that I had run across in other writings on mythology and in religious stories, which was the battle of the gods in heaven across time. And one of the things Eliade pointed out was that if you looked at the development of religious systems, so say the development of the religious system that came to dominate Mesopotamia, when the Mesopotamian tribes came together, so imagine each of those tribes had their own god, right? And then when they came together, that was terribly fractious, because you know what happens when different people with different gods get together. It's ugly. It's ugly. And it's no wonder, because you know, they each have an ethic, and they're living within the ethic, and they're using it to structure their worlds, but the ethics apparently collide. And so what happens at the civilizational level is that there's constant negotiation and cognitive transformation within the individual populations, but that's represented over the large span of time as a battle between the gods that represent the different tribes in heaven. And so then what happens across time is all those gods organize themselves into a hierarchy, and one god comes out on top, and that god is the supreme god. And then the societies like Mesopotamia, this happened in Mesopotamia, it also happened in ancient Greece, they assume that their sovereign is the person who acts out the sovereign god. Because you might say, well, where does the concept of sovereignty come from? Right? If it's not just brute force, and it's not, because brute force doesn't work, it has to have some other basis. What's the basis of sovereignty? What's the basis of authority? Not power, authority, competence, authority, right? Well, how is that played out? It's played out by the battle between ethics, systems of ethics that are represented in religious language across vast epochs of time. And then the societies of gods, let's say, organize themselves into a hierarchy, and they have a god at the top. And that's actually laid right out in the Enuma Elish, for example, which is the oldest creation story that we have, and out of which it's derived from the same, what would you say, cultural substrate as the stories in Genesis, for example, although it represents a variant. The Mesopotamians had all their gods aggregate themselves together because they were threatened by the unknown. That's what happens in the Mesopotamian creation myth. The unknown gives rise to the gods. They become very fractious and compete, and then the unknown decides to destroy them again, like God destroying Noah's people in the flood. It's the same basic idea. There's an idea there, and the idea is that we emerge out of the unknown, and we're always threatened by it, not only as individuals, but as a group. And that means that we need to figure out what it is that should guide us in order to continually confront the unknown and prevail. And so what happens in Mesopotamia is the gods all get together in a congress, and they elect a new god, and he's a new kind of god. And his name is Marduk, by the way. He has eyes all the way around his head. And so he pays attention. That's not the same as thinking. It's a different thing, attention. It's the same thing the Egyptians represented and worshipped with the Eye of Horus. The idea that what you should do if you want to survive in this world, if you want to play a voluntary game that everybody can participate in, your bloody eyes better be open, because they're the things that will save you, and that's attention. And the other thing that Marduk did, he spoke magic words. And so when he spoke, the night sky would appear, the day sky would appear. And so the Mesopotamians figured out in their great religious story that the fundamental sovereign God was he who pays attention and speaks the truth. And that's something. That's something. That's not something you punish people for, right? Because this is the deepest idea of mankind. It's developed in detail in Genesis, in the Old Testament. It's the fundamental idea of Genesis, that God uses the Logos, the Word of God, to cast potential, which we all face. That's what we face, potential, right? You know that. You know that. The future is unstructured. You have a potential within you that can meet that, and there's a potential that characterizes the future. You meet it with eyes open and with truthful speech. And that's what happens in Genesis, because God uses the Logos, which is truthful speech, to cast the pre-cosmogonic potential into habitable order. And then he says it's good. And there's a hint there, right? Because you think, well, is habitable order good? Because life is very difficult, and it's a real question whether or not the order that we inhabit is good. And the hypothesis in the Old Testament is that if truthful speech gives rise to the order, then that order will be good. And that's really something, man. Like, that's really something to apprehend. It's a fundamental theological presupposition that the way that you take the potential upon which the cosmos is predicated and cast it into the order that allows everyone to thrive is by using truthful speech. Wouldn't it be something if that was the case? And the thing is, you know it's the case. You know it. You know it. Because you do not admire yourself if you're deceitful. You admire yourself when you have those rare moments in your life where you can actually stand up and say what's true, regardless of the cost. And if you give that respect to other people, if you treat them as if they're the locale of the divine speech that casts potential into habitable order, then they like you. Maybe they even love you, and they get along with you, and you can work with them, and you can cooperate with them, and you can compete with them. So not only is it the fundamental axiom that regulates your relationship with yourself, it's the fundamental axiom that regulates your interactions with other people. And if you do not give them that honor, which is the presupposition for their natural right? Because the idea that you have a natural right is the idea that you have some sort of intrinsic value. If you don't treat people as if they have that intrinsic right, they are not happy with you, even if they don't know why. Because everyone wants to be treated as if they have free will, and as if they confront potential, and as if they're capable of making moral choices, and that they should be rewarded when they do things right, and perhaps punished when they do things wrong. Everyone wants that, and everyone knows it. And so, well, so what does that all have to do with free speech? Well, yes, everything. That's exactly right. So, free speech isn't free speech. You know, people think of free speech as kind of like a decoration, something like that in your life. It's not that at all. It's not the ability to speak truth to power, although it is also that. It's not that. It's way more than that. Free speech is how you think. It's not thinking. You know, the word that Genesis relies on to create the cosmos, let's say, in the story. By the way, that's the image of God in which you're made, male and female, that gives you that fundamental value that's at the core of our idea of natural right. It's not thinking, it's speaking. And the reason for that is, look, first of all, you can hardly think. It's really hard to think. You have to be trained like mad to think. You have to be able to divide yourself internally into a couple of different people. And then you have to let those people have a war in your head. And that means you have to develop characters who have opinions in great detail, opinions that might be contrary to your own, and then you have to withstand the tension of letting them have it out. And you only see that thinking in great literature. Like you see that in Dostoevsky. He's an absolute master of that. And you know, you can think a little bit, but mostly you're biased and you have confirmation bias and you see things the way you see them and you have massive blind spots and you're ignorant as hell. You just can't think, but you can talk. And the thing is, if you talk, other people will correct you. That's the thing. And that's thinking. So if you get up and you have something to say, and you say it stupidly, because of course you will, because what do you know, then other people will tell you where you're wrong. And then you can learn, right? And then everybody can think. And so what that also means is that to be free to speak, even to tell the truth, means you have to be free to be stupid and ignorant and malevolent and bitter. Because that is who you are. That is what you are, because you're flawed. So the idea that, you know, you can't use your free speech if it's offensive is just, it's an idea that is so, you don't know if its naivety outdoes its malevolence. It's a real battle. Which of those two things are worse? I would go with malevolence, because it attacks something that's so absolutely fundamental. It's like, well, of course people who are speaking freely are going to be offensive. I mean, have you ever had a serious discussion with anyone in your life? And I mean a serious discussion. I mean the sort of discussion you have when you're with your wife, when you're wondering whether your marriage is going to survive, or with your kids when they've done something that is really not in their best long-term interest. I mean a serious discussion. You can't even get off the ground without being offensive. You can't get off the ground without offending yourself in a conversation like that. You don't even want to admit how you feel or how you think to yourself. If you think you can have a difficult conversation without offending people, all that means is you're not having a difficult conversation. Because, well, an easy conversation, by definition, no one gets upset about that. There's no real problem. There's no real disagreement. There's no real world problem to be solved. It's just trivial. It's like discussing, you know, last night's sports event. There's nothing to it. If you're going to have a conversation about something that matters, you know, and the world is made out of what matters, that's a good thing to remember. If you're going to have a discussion about what matters, if you're really going to talk about it, everyone is going to be offended by that, especially if there's something rotten in the state of Denmark and you happen to be the one that is pointing it out. And so then you think, well, your freedom of speech, that's not about you being able to speak truth to power. That's about you being able to chart your destiny in the world. And more than that, it's even more, and that's important enough because, you know, life is hard, and if you don't get to think, when you walk through your life, you will fall into a pit. There's no doubt about that, because that's what thinking is for. It's to stop you from having any more catastrophes than are absolutely necessary, and it's a terribly difficult process. And so if that's interfered with, it isn't that you don't get to speak truth to power, it's that you do not get to act in the world in a manner that allows you to eliminate endless, unnecessary, hellish suffering. And not just for you, but for you and your family and your community. And so the enemies of free speech, they're the enemies of the process that turns potential into habitable order. They're enemies of the divine principle. And worse, they're their own enemies, right? Because this isn't, well, some of us believe in free speech and some of us don't. It's way deeper than that. If you don't believe in free speech, you don't believe in the implicit divinity of mankind. You don't believe in the sovereignty of the individual. You don't believe in sovereignty as such. You're a totalitarian of some sort, which means you attribute all the divine power to yourself. And then we know where that leads, right? It doesn't matter whether it's on the right or the left. If we had any sense and we took a look at 20th century history, we know exactly where things go. And we could easily choose not to go there. And so when we see someone like Raif, who's imprisoned by a reprehensible dictatorship that we have the gall to call our allies, then what we see is a system that's not only hell-bent on the destruction of an innocent and good man, but directly antithetical to everything that all of us have and that our societies put forward as necessary to the continual betterment of being itself. And so, no, and I've been so absolutely appalled by the Western world's weak-kneed response to the attacks of totalitarians upon our freedom of speech. Like, what was done with Salman Rushdie, that was a big, 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 big mistake, right? Because it wasn't Rushdie, it was the free-speaking artistic tradition of the West. And not only of the West, right? The free-speaking artistic creative tradition upon which the cosmos is properly established. That's what it was. And we all bowed down. We all bowed down with no resistance whatsoever. It was a massive error. We're going to pay for that for a very long time. We did the same thing with the Danish cartoons. And you don't want to think about these sorts of things as happening far away. Nothing happens far away. When it happens somewhere else, it's happening right here too. And that's why we're all here today, because we recognize that at least on some level. And we have to stop, we need to stop being so naive about our, let's say, our moral relativism. We need to take a look at history and biology in a very, very fundamental way, and we need to really understand what our culture and genuine cultures everywhere are predicated on, and that is the idea that the sovereign voice of the individual is the power that casts potential into habitable being and restructures tyrannical order when it needs to be restructured. Right? And that's what each of us are. That's the divine presence in each of us. And I do believe that there is no more fundamental truth than that. I don't believe that you can dig down underneath that. I think that's bedrock. That's the foundation stone of the house. That's the cornerstone of the house. And it requires everyone to courageously confront the tyranny that's them and the unknown that surrounds them, and to work for their own benefit and for the benefit of their families and for the benefit of their communities, and to do everything they can to benefit the world and to live with true speech as the highest value. That's how we sort out the world. And we could sort it out, we are sorting it out at a very rapid rate, and we could do that much, much more effectively. I do believe that it's incumbent on us to understand the absolutely fundamental role that these processes take. I know we're here today because we all have at least an intimation of that, right? We know that there's something about free speech that's so central that we cannot allow attacks on it to go unchallenged no matter where they occur. But it's very useful to have it articulated and to know that this is bedrock, right? And it's not something arbitrary, and it's not a mere game that we're only playing in the West. None of that. It's something, it's the most fundamental truth that the human race has ever discovered. And we lose it at our absolute peril. And it's not death, it's worse than that, the peril. Because there are worse things than death. And the worst thing than death is hell. And we saw plenty of that in the 20th century. And when we let freedom of speech go, that's where we're headed. And unless we want to go there, then we should stop aiming for it. So, well, thank you very much for the invitation. Good night.
The moment has come for the presentation of our award. Linda, I'm going to turn over to you, and you're going to ask Ensaf.
Yes. This is the award. We do think it's quite beautiful, and on it it says Freedom Award honoring Raif Badawi for his extraordinary courage on behalf of freedom of speech. This is our first Freedom Award, and we are very proud to present it to his wife, Ensaf. Ensaf, would you like to come up here? Ensaf would like her daughter to come up and say a few words. Her son. Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oui.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Doudi Badawi. J'ai 13 ans. Je ne pouvais pas comprendre pourquoi nous quittions l'Arabie Saoudite. Je n'avais que 7 ans. Nous sommes réveillés un jour, Najwa, Myriam et moi. et tout notre linge était emballé dans des valises. J'ai senti la panique se répandre dans mon corps. J'ai demandé « Que se passe-t-il » ? « Nous devons partir », qu'elle m'a répondu. « Papa viendra nous rejoindre plus tard. » J'étais tellement surpris que tu nous laisses partir sans toi. Cela ne nous faisait pas de sens. Pendant tout le voyage, j'étais tellement fâchée contre toi, mais je n'ai rien dit. 2 ans ont passé et tu ne nous l'as pas encore rejoint. Je demandais toujours à maman, quand est-ce qu'il arrive? Bientôt, il ne reste plus qu'un peu. Alors j'attendais que nous sommes partis pour le Canada. Quand nous sommes partis pour le Canada, je m'attendais à ce que tu nous surprennes à l'aéroport, mais tu n'étais pas là. J'étais encore fâchée. Pendant très longtemps, j'ai cru que tu nous avais quittés. Je pensais que tu nous aimais plus, que nous ne comptions plus pour toi. Pendant très longtemps, je me suis inquiétée pour maman. Qu'allait-il nous arriver sans toi? Pendant tout ce temps, j'ai gardé ma colère pour moi-même. Elle a grandi, j'étais confus, j'avais le cœur brisé. Le jour est arrivé où j'ai appris la vérité. Que tu étais en prison. Que tu étais en prison parce que tu parlais de tes convictions, que tu étais intelligent et patriotique. Et que tu ne nous aurais jamais laissé tomber si tu avais eu le choix. C'était très difficile d'entendre que tu avais passé tout ce temps en prison. Mais le sentiment de soulagement était plus fort. Le sentiment que tu nous aimais toujours, que tu pensais à nous, que nous comptions toujours à tes yeux. Ma colère s'est envolée et j'étais remplie de désir, d'une certitude que nous allions nous revoir. Je t'attends toujours, mais cette fois-ci, avec le cœur rempli d'espoir. Que le roi Salman te pardonnera et que tu reviendras nous rejoindre aussi aimant et aimé que toujours. I love you, Dad. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Bonne soirée.